this week's episode of LevelUp Cyber. My name is Tony Bryan, your host and Executive Director of CyberUp. Really glad to be with everybody today. Excited to jump into today's conversation. I'm going to have to admit this is a new one for me and a new topic that I think we've all heard the gist and parameters of what these three little letters are going to mean, but very excited to dive into it with today's guest, Jeremy Snyder, founder and CEO of Firetail. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hey, Tony, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. And don't worry, by the way, you're not alone. You heard those three letters like a lot of people have, but you don't exactly know what they mean. That describes, I think, most people that we end up meeting.
I think even as you and I were just kind of chit-chatting, getting ready for today, I think it's, let's drop the bag. We're going to talk about API and API security today.
Yeah.
But I think API is one of those things that interacts with our lives every single day, from the websites and things we navigate. And we have no concept of what we're allowing those things to talk, but there is a lot of risks and things we got to dive into, especially from a company perspective of how that could be. So very excited to jump into this conversation with you today and learn all about it. But before we do, I'd love for you to take a second, introduce yourself, where you're from, what you've jumped into. I know you shared a couple startups you've been a part of as well, so I'd love to hear all about that.
Yeah, happy to. So where I'm from is a tougher question because I was actually an Army brat and my mother's from Finland. So by the time, I think the easiest way to think about it is by the time I finished high school, I had spent time in 4 countries as well as 4 states here in the U.S. I ended up graduating from Chapel Hill High School in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, ended up doing my undergrad split between Finland and the U.S. I currently live in the Washington, D.C. area, but I've also spent time in France, Germany, Singapore, and Finland, of course, throughout my life. So my background is that I actually studied computational linguistics, and I actually thought I would be a software developer, but it turns out I wasn't really good enough at writing code to cut it on the software development side. I was lucky enough, though, that I joined a company at about age 22 that was just growing really rapidly. And they had need for somebody who was willing to kind of jump in and learn on the IT infrastructure, systems administration, and cybersecurity side. So that started kind of the first half of my career, about 13 years as a, IT and cyber hands-on keyboard practitioner. Did that for a couple of SaaS companies and then a video game company for 4 years there. And as that video game company was kind of starting to implode, like we really weren't making it, there was this little company called Amazon Web Services that was getting started, and they were talking to people about this concept of the cloud. And they were hiring people who were looking to make the transition from being more of a practitioner into talking to other practitioners about what this cloud thing could do for them and the way that they were running IT at their organizations. So that kind of changed the trajectory of my career, if you will. And I really have kind of been in customer facing roles ever since, at a variety of companies. Since leaving Amazon, I've spent some time with a company in the online backup space. I spent some time working at a company that helped customers migrate to the cloud. And that was actually where I kind of got some of the initial inspiration for what Firetail is today. But then I think, one of the biggest inspirations was really a stretch I spent of about 4.5 years at a cloud security software company where we got to work with some of the biggest cloud footprints around the world. We're talking about the likes of, Spotify, for instance, and the cloud footprint that they had. And I got to spend some time actually on site with them in Stockholm and learn about some of their interesting challenges and, just how challenging it is to run a cloud environment at the scale of a company like that. And, super educational experience, super informative, learned a lot along that journey. That company ended up being acquired in 2020. I spent about 1.5 years with the company that acquired us, Rapid7, and then connected with my co-founder in late 2021. And we started Firetail in early 2022. So that's a little bit of my background.
That sounds like a pretty busy few years with a wide range of backgrounds, but specifically for Firetail, you're highlighting and focusing on the idea of API security. So I always find level setting definitions is a really important part because there's lots of different ways to say words. So for the sake of everybody in a ground zero approach to this, what is API and what does it mean to me?
Well, look, let's just start with the acronym itself, Application Programming Interface. The simplest way is when you think about interface, it is the way that a piece of software talks to another piece of software, right? So that is the interface between two applications, if you will, right? Those two pieces of software. An example that I like to use to really make it personal to everybody who is using the internet today, and I think it's pretty safe to assume that if you're listening to a podcast or you're watching a video of this conversation, you're using the modern internet. And so I like to give the example of a food delivery service because I think it really illustrates what APIs are and how powerful they are, crystal clear. So think about this. When you are using DoorDash, Uber Eats, it could be Delivery Hero, Foodora, Just Eat, whatever it's called, wherever in the world you're watching this from, you're familiar with the idea that there is like a mobile food delivery service, some kind of app on your phone. And you're going to pick up that app or your phone, you're going to open up that app. And actually, let's just talk through what ends up happening there. So, first thing that happens is you kind of log into the central service, and then you're sending or your phone is sending your coordinates. So that's typically your GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude, to that service. Let's just call it DoorDash for the sake of simplicity here. And what DoorDash is going to do is it's going to say, okay, based on this location, what restaurants are available for Jeremy right now? And it's going to send me back a list of restaurants that are available for me to browse and order from in that area. I'm going to look through the menus. I'm going to pick some items. I'm going to add them to my cart. And then I'm going to click order. Awesome. Well, let's remember here, we're using a service like DoorDash. We're not buying food from DoorDash. We're actually buying food from some restaurant. And again, DoorDash itself is not showing up to deliver that food to us. Rather, some independent contractor operating as a DoorDash driver or, bicycle-based delivery person or whatever it is actually going to bring that to my house. So how did that all happen magically? And that's where APIs come in. So I sent my order to this company, DoorDash. DoorDash then sent my order to the restaurant. The restaurant confirmed receipt of the order. DoorDash also sent my payment credentials to a third-party payment provider who, runs my credit card, etc. And then DoorDash sent my home address to that delivery service or that delivery individual. All of those connections between me and between DoorDash and the restaurant, the payment processor, and the delivery service, all of those are done over APIs. So I kind of like to call them the plumbing of the modern internet. Some people will say like duct tape, some people will say pipes, whatever. But they're the thing that connects data or the thing that connects services between third parties on the modern internet. Does that all make sense?
If I could find my mouse to click unmute so I wasn't clicking on ears, yes, totally makes sense. That is a really concrete example. I think it gives me a really good visual representation, and also really it's just indicative of like how many things actually talk when we're trying to do the stuff on our day-to-day basis. I mean,
Yeah.
I think of DoorDash or think of even an Uber is kind of crazy of just how many different things are talking along that path there. We gave into that, if we want to take a step, there, as I'm saying, let me pause, capture my thoughts. Let's go over an example of like where things can go wrong, right? Because where there may be a concern or an option, where you are talking about some cybersecurity and some risks here, and you've built a software that's intended to kind of help protect that, right? So, what are some of the risks and concerns that happen throughout all that kind of process you just described?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we think through that process that I just described, first of all, let's remember what kind of data is being processed there. So we've got some very sensitive personal information, right? So we've got myself, my name, my home address, my identity, everything that's wrapped up in that, all of which could be valuable either for an identity theft purpose or just in terms of, let's say abusing or harassing me. But then we've also got my payment credentials that were sent to this credit card provider. So obviously there's risk of fraud and theft on that side. So I'll take a concrete example of something that happened in 2020. You might remember while we were all at home during lockdown, there was this stationary bicycle company that is kind of a hybrid software hardware service, right? So it's this company called Peloton. You have this bike at home, it's got a little tablet display on it. And you log into that tablet display, and it's going to track your progress and it's going to customize programs for you. And it's going to connect you to a specific trainer or a specific type of course that you might like, exercise program that you might like on that bike. Well, that is actually a piece of software on that kind of hardware device that's mounted on the exercise bike. So what happened in 2020 was that somebody thought to themselves, hey, this thing is probably using my home Wi-Fi. And by using my home Wi-Fi, it's probably sending data over an API to and from that backend Peloton service, very similar to what we just described in the DoorDash example. And sure enough, that is the case, of course. And that's the case with every smart device that you have at home. It's using your home Wi-Fi and it's using some APIs to send data to its central servers. Awesome. Well, what the threat actor in this case figured out by just watching, if you ever are curious about this, you can actually log into your home Wi-Fi device and you can see the logs of all of the devices that are on your Wi-Fi network and what they're communicating with. You'll also see, like, when you do a Google search and so on, that'll show up in there as well. So this person went and found all of the Peloton communication. So what is this bicycle sending to the Peloton servers? And he noticed that there was a pattern in all of the requests. And the pattern was that you could see very clearly that it logged in with something called a key, which is a credential. And probably everybody will have seen these. They tend to be like long alphanumeric strings, anywhere from, 16 to 256 characters or longer. And then he started to see some other things embedded in there. So there was like a user ID number and a profile ID number. And a user ID number, let's just call it 1, and then a profile ID number equal to 1 as well. And he thought to himself, well, what if I change that profile ID from 1 to 2? And sure enough, he was able to make that change, send that request to the Peloton servers over that same API, and actually see somebody else's profile. And with that profile, they were able to see that person's exercise preferences, their progress, their, training regime, all of that. That also includes things like, account information, preferences, whatnot. And, in this case, thankfully, the damage was just kind of, let's say, PII, meaning like names, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, and not, let's say, payment credentials. But they were able to just kind of like start fiddling with those numbers in those API calls and get 3 million people's private information and details. So that's an example of what can go wrong with those APIs. If the APIs aren't structured well, meaning that they're not checking your what's called authentication, the way that you prove that you are who you claim to be, and then secondarily, your authorization, the way that you validate that you have permission to access the data that you're requesting. Those two things, very often you'll hear authentication, authorization, or in the cyber world, you'll hear auth N, auth Z. People often mix them up. People often think they're one and the same. It's not the case. Then there are subtle but very important differences, as kind of proven by this example. So hopefully that gives an idea. This is kind of indicative. I use this example pretty intentionally because it's pretty indicative of what happens to many APIs that get breached.
It makes sense. I mean, as you described it, it totally makes sense of just something that, thinking outside the box to find an exploit there, something that just to be kind of poke around and see what information is being given makes a ton of sense. And I feel like that's, from what I've understood and heard from most of the breaches, that's really what happens for some of the big ones is you're just poking around and finding small loopholes, right, that you can exploit and do. So what are ways in which we can, try to combat those things, right? Or to make sure that our API chains and linkage, right, are necessary, right? I think of websites and HubSpot and websites and payment processes and PCI stuff. And, there's a lot of stuff, what are some things that small to mid-size or even big businesses can do to make that better?
Well, I'll start with the good news. And the good news is that, let's say in the example that you just gave, which I think is typical for many smaller to medium-sized businesses, you're writing very few of your own APIs if you're a small to medium business. You're probably consuming a lot of third-party APIs from exactly the likes of the companies that you mentioned, the HubSpots, the Stripes, the Twilios of the world, Plaid, and any number of kind of common services that you might hear of. Google Analytics would be another one that's a super common API service. And the good news is that those services have been around for many, many years. These are companies that have very high levels and standards of security. They've been pen tested regularly. They're doing a pretty good job. Many of them have lots of industry certifications like SOC 2, PCI, HIPAA, et cetera, whatever they might have. And so generally speaking, you can feel pretty good about those companies. Now, where it's starting to get a little bit more interesting is that if you are a smaller to medium business and you're starting to develop your own software that talks to those APIs or that accepts incoming requests from those APIs, this is where you need to start really thinking about the design of your APIs. And I don't want to get too technical for the audience, but I'll just give like a couple of quick pointers, and I think anybody can really Google these things pretty quickly. First is, there's any number of training courses on YouTube completely free where if you just say, hey, API security, authentication, you're going to find some very good quality videos produced by, we have a set of our own, but the truth is actually many of our competitors have produced really good quality content on there as well to just try to educate people about, hey, if you're building an API right now, focus on the design. These are the things that can go wrong. So start with that. So that's actually where I would tell anybody to go get started is just go to YouTube, be like API security, best practices, authentication, authorization, some combination of those terms. Going to be a great starting point as you think about designing a service that you're building on your own. Second thing I would tell anybody who's building an API is APIs have something called a design document, very often referred to as a specification file. You'll hear different terms like Swagger file, Open API spec, Open API spec file, whatever. They're all effectively referring to the same thing. And this is basically a planning document, an architectural design document that describes how your API works. And it is a really, really good way as you're building an API to kind of check that you're really going through all of the design principles as you do design and build out that API. And if you've already written the code, by the way, the other good news is that there's a lot of kind of free services where you can point this service at your code and it will generate one of these for you. And this is a great way. This is great for, let's say, like if the developer leaves your organization and somebody else has to take over, this is a great way for them to get up to speed on it. It's also a great way for a security professional to look at your API and kind of say, okay, well, these are the potential vulnerabilities that you've got in your design. Let's start there on improving your process. So those are kind of two good getting started recommendations that I would give to anybody who is in the process of building their own APIs and is looking for some guidance there on what to do. And I think the last thing I'd say on this topic is like, if this is a brand new topic to you, which it is to a lot of people, like we said, kind of at the beginning of the episode, we've done a lot of research to try to explain what these issues are, similar to the way that we've just kind of gone through these examples. But we've produced a State of API Security 2024 report, completely free. It's on our website. If you just go to firetail.io, or if you just Google Firetail State of API Security, it will definitely be within the top 3 responses there. And like I said, free of charge. It'll kind of walk you through a lot of the risk areas, walk you through a lot of, what goes wrong, how APIs get breached, etc. Great introduction, good overview, and then deep dive on a few topics in there that are super important for people to look at.
But it kind of blows my mind as you're sitting here thinking about it. And as much as I've talked around half the stuff in security, to not hear 3 letters, right? I know I've integrated multiple different functions of API for software, technology, and things we've done, or even software we've purchased, right?
Yep.
Why do you suppose it hasn't necessarily been as big of a focus as maybe it could be around API security? Or why is it something we're not hearing as much around as like pen testing or SOC?
Yeah.
Like those are the main functions you always hear, because I almost think of it
Yeah.
a little bit OT, right? This is OT security related, just not without the manufacturing, because it does seem like a very core business practice for a lot of companies here.
Yeah, look, I think it's something where there's kind of 2 things that I think really are kind of causing it to be where it is today. And I certainly, obviously, we agree with you that it's not as prevalent or as talked about as we think it should be. One is that, we're just coming out of the pandemic, or maybe let's say we came out in the last like 2 or 3 years or whatever. But that period of lockdown and that period of, let's say, hyper aggressive shift to the cloud actually created a security backlog for a lot of companies. And I think a ton of companies are still kind of coming to grips with them. They just pushed so much to the cloud so quickly that they don't really have visibility necessarily. They may not have even checked the boxes on some of the basics for, kind of core cybersecurity practices that they want to put around this. And so they look at like, oh, shoot, I just need to do, basic cloud identity security. And you want to talk to me about this kind of esoteric API thing that is super niche and specific. That we get that response a lot for people who don't really realize the scale of the problem necessarily. I think that is one big thing. The other thing is that I think there's also an aspect of whose job is this? APIs are kind of funny because, we've talked about what goes wrong with an API, and it's almost always in the design of the API. But when you go talk to an organization, you've got a cybersecurity team, and then you've got the development team that wrote the APIs. And very often you actually have a little bit of an organizational disconnect between those two teams. The people who can actually fix the API design problems are very often the developers, but the people who are responsible for monitoring and securing the APIs are very often the security team. So you got a little bit of a gap there that needs to be bridged. And, not to get too deep into it, but we realized this in maybe like the first year of our existence, that we were trying to talk to both sides, and we realized that we had to kind of build our platform in a way that speaks both sides' languages. And that's not that easy, by the way, just out of the box, to figure out, like, how do I present security data to the security teams and, let's say design data to the developers who are responsible for this thing. It's not super easy. When you have a problem that is like crystal clear, like, hey, this is an HR problem and Tony runs HR, super easy. I know who to talk to. I know how that person should fix it, maybe, or whatnot. But when you've got a problem that's kind of distributed across the organization, that can take a little bit more time, and that can take a little bit more time for the organizations themselves to understand and embrace.
I've got a couple more questions, but if I'm a company, right, when would I know that I need to start looking at when should I have concern about my own API security? You know what I mean? Like, are there indicators? Are there telltale signs that I should be exploring or looking for, maybe to know that, like, oh, this is something I need to address today?
Yeah, look, first of all, if you're in a regulated space, it's whenever you have regulated data that is kind of flowing over an API. That would be like the crystal clear trigger point. If you're in telecommunications, insurance, financial services, banking, healthcare, legal, whatever. Once you know that you have some data that falls under your industry regulator's purview that is going over an API, you should start thinking about this. If that doesn't describe you, if you're not in a regulated space, then I would say it's when you have the kind of data that is going to cost you a fine, or is going to cost you to pay for identity monitoring for people whose data could be breached, right? So you may not be regulated, but if you leak my home address, my social security number, my email address, whatever, chances are you're going to be paying for LifeLock or Identity Guard or whatever those services are for me when that data gets breached. That would be another really good trigger point. There's one last one that is in kind of, just the state of where we're at right now. We see organizations increasingly incorporating AI services, third-party AI services, into their homegrown applications. I would again ask you that question. When you see that you're sending sensitive data to the third-party AI service, that's when you should start thinking about API security, because the way that you're integrating that AI service is over an API. And that is true, by the way, in like 99.99% of cases. Any company incorporating a third-party AI service is doing it over an API.
I mean, any software I've ever bought over the years has some form of API that I'm going to have to turn on and talk to my system, right? Like, it's an inevitable thing that I imagine has a pretty important part. I don't know. I was definitely shocked and surprised to learn a little bit about this today. And really just the important role that it plays. I'd be remiss not to just sit here and think about, Internet of Things devices that are constantly being made, that are requiring access and more access to things like that's. And the lack of regulation on IoT devices, especially on platforms like Amazon, right, where God only knows where you're getting things, and now you're connecting into Wi-Fi. So those things always give me concern. And I just think something as easy as this could really have a huge role and impact on the things that we're doing. So let's say I'm a college student, or, I'm trying to explore, like many people currently are, like, man, what I want to be when I grow up. I know I want to do cyber, but I don't know what specifically within the role. Let's say and I have to say, I've never seen specific API job titles, right? API analyst or things like that, which probably goes back to the second you just said, where what department does it actually fall under, right?
Yeah.
Cyber. But what are ways that I could go out and gain some skills or learn some best practices around API security? And maybe I'm working for a company. I want to bring it to my boss and start having some conversation about it. Where could I go to find that information?
Well, so first I'll just kind of repeat some of the stuff I said earlier. Just the YouTube stuff. There's actually just a ton of great free content out there around that. So don't pass up free, don't pass up good, don't pass up video. That's really super easy to consume. So that's a great starting point to get going there. But second thing I would say is like, look, um, every cyber job right now is moving in the direction of kind of understanding data. Like almost every cyber job is really data centric in one way or the other. There's almost nothing that is hardware anymore. It's pretty much all software driven. So to that end, as you're thinking about your own career, or let's say even a step before that, you're a junior, senior in university years, and you're looking at how to kind of prepare yourself for whether it's API security or something else that's a modern cyber type of role, take a programming class or two. Don't shy away from them. Don't think, oh, well, I'm going to be doing security. I don't need to know how to program. Even if you don't end up at a place where you use your programming skills regularly, the programming skills that you learn will be super valuable in helping to assess code that your organization might be creating, or in communicating with the developers of your organization who might be responsible for things like the design of software, fixing the security flaws in the design of software, et cetera. And then especially, so much of cybersecurity today is about figuring out how did data from system A correlate to data from system B to indicate that we have a threat, we have an attacker, we have a risk, we have a vulnerability. So anything that you can do with software or systems to tie two pieces of data together is a super, super valuable skill set to have. So those are a couple of just, kind of starting recommendations around this for anybody who's thinking about it. And by the way, one of the things that I would say to anybody out there who is thinking about a career in cybersecurity, actually two things I would say. First of all, it's a super broad space. There is security aspects to everything from, IoT that we've talked about a couple times on this show, whether that is the BIOS and the ROM that's on the smart device itself, to the APIs at the back end service, to the structure of the data behind the scenes. Just that right there is a couple of different topics that might be of interest to different people based on, where their interests lie. Everything on that side to the identity side to the big data AI ML side, there's a huge, huge range of things to look at. And if you're more interested in kind of trying to break into systems, there are many, 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 many careers in pen testing, bug bounty, things like that, offensive security for larger organizations and whatnot. And if you're more interested in, let's say, like regulatory compliance and governance and things like that, you'll often see organizations, mostly larger ones, but you'll often see organizations with a ton of job openings in an area called GRC, governance, risk, and compliance. And that requires a mindset that's more around kind of, let's say, project and process management, which may be of interest to another mindset or another group of people. So it's a great space. And then the last thing I'll say about it is, I actually thought I was going to get out of cybersecurity at one point in my career, and then COVID happened. And as COVID was happening, it so happened that the company I was with at the time was working with a couple of the companies working on the research around the vaccines. And I realized, like, okay, I'm never going to be the research scientist that develops the vaccines, but I knew that research work was being done on cloud platforms that were being secured with our software. And so I realized, and these companies, by the way, I should have said, these companies were under constant attack, but they were confident in making huge investments onto their cloud platforms because they had a layer of security that they felt comfortable with. And so in the cybersecurity space, you may not be the innovator who is creating the new widget or the new breakthrough or whatever, but if you're protecting the systems where that research is happening, that's a really valuable function. And I actually found kind of purpose in that myself, that recommitted the next steps of my career into cybersecurity. And I will say that I just got back from Black Hat and I just talked to a ton of people. And it's definitely an industry where this kind of shared feeling of we're all doing important work here. we're all helping our organization stay secure. We're all doing our best to protect data. That is something that is actually really rewarding as you go through your career.
It's a really, really good answer, by the way. I mean, it was solid advice for somebody just to constantly learn and grow with this piece. So I do appreciate the insight there for folks looking to break in. We've hit our 30 minutes. We always do. It goes way faster than I ever anticipate. And I feel like I say it every time. But everybody gets the same last question. What advice would you give somebody to level up their cybersecurity career?
Yeah, look, I mean, I've given a lot of kind of tactical things, but one thing that I will say to anybody who is in the just kind of thinking through their own mindset and their own approach to problems. And there's an offensive side to cybersecurity and a defensive side to cybersecurity. To the people that I've talked to who have had the most successful careers on the offensive side of cybersecurity, when I asked them what makes them successful, one of them put it the best to me. He said his boss, this guy, in working with his boss, when he couldn't break into a system, his boss would say, just keep trying. Just try to be more creative around it. Think laterally, think of other paths in. So if you can find some kind of activity or some kind of pursuit that gets you to start to develop the creativity in your mindset, that is something that will serve you super well in the cybersecurity domain, whether it's at the beginning phase or at any point over the course of your career. So try to find something that develops creativity in you.
Another solid answer, man. You bring in all the words of knowledge and nuggets today, which I truly appreciate. I know listeners do as well. But Jeremy, it was so great to talk with you today. I definitely enjoyed learning something new, right? I feel like all too often we have a tendency to live in an echo chamber in this cybersecurity space and say a lot of the same things, maybe in different ways. So to hear something new and a new topic around API, something that's very important, I know for me was really interesting and a great topic to learn about today. So thank you so much for joining the show. I mean, I wish you luck with Firetail and as you continue to grow and help in advocating for this for other companies and organizations to look at API. So if you haven't, I encourage everybody to check out Jeremy, check out Firetail, and look at dive into API. And if you have questions, reach out to Jeremy and see if there's some advice there. Look into it. So. Thank you all so much for joining. Jeremy, thanks again as well for being a guest. And until
My
next
pleasure.
time, I'll see you guys soon. Thanks.